Hello, and welcome to this episode of Rule of Carnage. Uh,
Hello.
this is a series of podcasts, videos, chats between myself, Glenn Ford, a games designer and developer, and my good chum, Mike Hutchinson, also games designer and developer.
Hi.
Um, Hi. One of the subjects of conversation we've decided to attempt to make a semi-series, let's put it that
Mhm.
way, is pinching and nicking and stealing and filching mechanics from other games and slotting them into uh, tabletop minis games. And this is particularly apposite at this exact moment because Mike has just, as this video comes out, or slightly before this video comes out, put a game out into the wild that has borrowed some mechanics from the world of dexterity games of balancing and stacking, and not in this case flicking, but all that kind of goodness.
Yeah, maybe as I write some of the additional rules that need to be added, maybe I'll get to flicking.
So, Mike, do you want to tell us a little bit about space gits and the dexterity mechanics within?
Yeah, so I have published up on itch an alpha version of Space Gits, which is a low minis count skirmish game. What is the first one of those that I have done? But it is partly sort of an attempt to make the most Gasland skirmish game I can make. So it's also inspired by the fact that our mate Rufus gave me some old 80s metal Rogue Trader orcs, which I started painting up. And then, of course, when I have lovely miniatures, then a game must emerge. So Space Kits is an attempt, as you say, to marry miniature games and dexterity games. And so it's got right now it's in alpha, and so I don't know exactly where it's going to end up, but like right now it's got dexterity mechanics in all sorts of places. So almost every part of the game is based on some kind of dexterity mechanics. Shall I explain them to you?
Probably a good idea at this juncture, yes.
Excellent. So miniatures. Basically, there's a little stack of dice next to each of the orcs, and that is the sort of crucial thing that the game revolves around. So when you activate an orc, when he's done, he has a swig, and he has to put a dice next to him. If he gets shot or punched with something that would add damage to him, he has to put more dice on there. Instead of damage tokens, you get more dice, and so the tower gets more and more precarious. These piles of d6. But when you move around or are forced to move by, for example, getting shoved in combat, then you have to move the miniature and the pile of dice simultaneously. And so with sort of 2 or 3 dice, that's no problem at all. But once you get to 7 or 9 d6s all stacked up, it's hilariously difficult. And likely the dice tower will tumble. And if the dice tower tumbles, then the orc is fallen over. You have to lay him on his side. Orcs can't, they're too drunk to get up themselves. A friend has to come over and use one of their actions to hoik him up. But if the enemy gets over first, then he can pat him down and nick some loot tokens from you. So it's a sort of down and not out rather than dead. There's no like the orcs don't actually die. They just once all of them have fallen over, like they're all tortoises that can't get up, and the game ends.
Fair enough. Yeah,
And then the other part of it is shooting is a dexterity. Well, wait a minute, I haven't covered movement. So that's the main dexterity mechanic, is that like activations and wounds are this tower. And
mhm.
then as we were writing the chapter on uses of dice for fundamentals of tabletop miniature games design, like that chapter was so inspirational to me. I was like, all right, let's see if I can pinch almost every one of these ideas and see if I can fit them in. So the way that movement works is when you activate an orc, you basically get to do 2 things. You can move, you can shoot, you can help up an orc, or you can pat down an orc an enemy orc that you're stood next to. And moving is you take 3 dice and you toss them into the play area. And I haven't got rules about exactly how you do that. That's sort of more in more encapsulated in the golden rules section up at the front. But you toss the 3 dice, and then you've got 3 dice that are both a number and a position. And so you move the rolled number of inches towards that dice, and you can resolve the 3 dice in any order you like. If you bump into something, you stop that dice, and if you bump into an enemy orc, you stop the whole movement, and you have to transition into a fight. So it's fun because rolling the dice, sometimes it works out great, and you go exactly where you're expecting, but because you have to go the full distance and you have to use all the dice, like it is quite likely that if you have a dodgy roll, your dude just wanders around drunkenly staggering from one direction to another, not exactly going where you wanted, because this is intended to be inebriated orcs, and it's a sort of it's an experiment to see whether the control removal can be fun because it is wrapped in like a slightly childish dexterity game.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Where it's like, is that intended to be a dexterity mechanic? Like you're meant to get good at throwing the dice,
Mm-hmm.
and now do you have to roll like throw them all at the same time? You can roll them one at a time, or is it meant to be a random mechanic? I don't know if you there's a game uh, by a Japanese publisher. I want to say Iti, but I'm probably wrong about an octopus. And the way that works is you've got to drop things onto a table and then like go around and pick the things up. The reason I mention it is the octopus in question is like a domed creature that you put onto your like seaboard. And the
Mm.
reason that it exists as this little wooden domed head is it's a baffle. So you drop the dice directly onto the top of its head, and because it's domed, there's no way of like intentionally making the pieces that you drop go in one direction or another. It's like totally chaotic.
Yeah, so in this case, I am aiming for much more of a like when I think about dexterity games that I have played and enjoyed, and I am potentially pinching from on some level. Like a classic one is Catacombs that I've played loads, which is like a 2p. It's like a coin sort of flipping and nudging and flicking game. And that one, like it can be quite random where the pieces go, particularly once you start getting ricochets. Like you don't really know where the ricochet is going to end up. But there is like a pleasing element of the first few times you do it, you're like annoyingly rubbish, and you imagine you're going to be much better than you are, but you kind of get your eye in over the game. And so I think with the movement system here, it's absolutely supposed to be a sort of an imagine like there's an imagination of skill, and there will be like an element to which the terrain and the nature of the dice is just so unpredictable.
This is a totally random and possibly entirely personal thing that I'll
Mm,
just say now. It's like I love balancing dexterity games. I
mm.
hate flicking dexterity games. I absolutely, anytime I see something balancing, and also realize like picking up like the new Oink game, Drop Poltergeist. I really, really want to get a hold of because it's this thing we got to drop certain things out of your hand than others. That I love.
Mm.
Flicking, I hate it. It's not even being bad at it. It's just I don't want to even learn to be good at it. It doesn't
Don't want to break your
impact
nails.
with me for some reason. I don't. Anyway, that's entirely by the by. So
Yeah, so there isn't any flicking in this yet. But then, so the movement is always 3d6, and the dice tower is always d6. And then funny sized dice get introduced in the shooting mechanic. So the shooting mechanic is very similar to the moving mechanic. Um, like each weapon will have a number of attack dice. So the rifle is like 1d12, the minigun is like 6d6, and you roll the dice into the play area, and the number on the dice is added to the range of the weapon. So the rifle is a 10-inch range. So if I roll a 7, I've now got a bullet that is traveling 17 inches from the guy that shot it towards the dice. And the first thing, and I get to draw a line from anywhere on the base to anywhere on the dice. So the bigger the dice, the more like flexible this is. We'll come to that in a minute. Um, so you draw a line from anywhere on the base to anywhere on the dice, and the first thing that gets crossed in the direction of the bullet's travel is the thing that gets hit. And if that's an orc, then they take the damage. And in this case, if the dice is even, they take what's called big damage, which for a rifle is 4 dice. Or if it's odd, they take half damage, which in the case of a rifle is 2. So bullet travels along from shooter to rolled dice. So you're going to roll the dice towards, sort of nearby your target. And it's funny because the closer you roll the dice to the miniature, the more like scope of thing. Anyway, there's all kinds of baloney.
Yeah. So if the dice lands beyond the range of the rifle, that doesn't make any difference. You're
No,
still
because it's
drawing
just
a
a it's
line.
just a direction indicator.
Yeah, okay. And yeah, I mean that's curious. It's interesting because the idea of randomized ranges, I think, is also an interesting one. I think it's
Yeah,
interesting.
because this is a piece of like I'm really pleased with this as a shooting mechanic because like shooting is quite unpredictable and quite short ranged as a result of this, which are both things that I like about, you know.
I think it's interesting you've gone for non-contiguous dice there, which is just a really bizarre choice to have made.
What do you mean?
The odds do one thing and evens do another.
Hmm.
It does it's not 1 to 3 is a small hit and 4 to 6 is a big
No,
hit.
because that works with all the dice shapes.
I mean, all the dice are even, aren't they? So you can halve all of them and have the top half be one thing and the bottom half be
Yeah,
another. But
you
it
you
doesn't.
could you could you
It's
could.
it's willful to go for a non-contiguous dice result. That is as interesting. I mean, the dice stacking and the different size dice thing, I think, is interesting. But partly is have you considered involving different shaped dice into the stacking mechanic?
Yeah, no, I've thought about it, but I haven't gone to that point yet because the game is chaotic enough without that. Um, and there's enough problems to address, and I haven't yet with this core set of mechanics.
It's
What I did add in the last revision, but I haven't play tested with another human yet, is the actual like wording of the wound rule is if you wound another orc, you give the boss of that orc some d6 and they have to stack them. So technically you can give them any dice you want as long as it's a d6, which, it because that's kind of how this game is. So I've got some of those like 3 millimeter ones from Pirates of the Spanish Main, so they'll
right.
come at some
Okay.
point.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I guess that is definitely a question, and that is okay.
and also the grippy rubber squig dice, like double-edged sword, because they grip together quite well. But like if you try and move that across, unless it's like a Vaseline slicked glass table.
So this is sort of, I think, coming to the first of what I consider one of the big game design questions for putting dexterity mechanics out of a board game into a minis game.
Mhm.
Is that in a board game, a box game, you have very tight controls over exactly what is going into that game.
Yeah.
Um, like as a great example of like a dexterity game. I don't know if you know this, but actual Jenga sets, the blocks are slightly different width
Mm.
intentionally, and
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
design
they're
point.
they're intentionally like mismanufactured, but they aren't.
Yeah, whereas knockoff Jenga sets tend to be all even because they're knocking off Jenga and they're not aware that it's an intentional choice that you're meant to be able to slide some blocks out
Yeah.
more easily than others. Whereas obviously here, where you're going, grab some d6, somebody who gets a block of nice, like casino dice d6 is going to have a very different experience of the game.
Mm.
Somebody who grabs their collection of like teeny little mini d6s
Yeah, and like the thing is that, because like one of these 12 mil D6s are very, very ubiquitous and 16 mil D6s are very, very ubiquitous. Like there is another draft of this game where I can say with total confidence, like only use, 12 mil D6s or only use, and that would be like I could just be 99% sure that people would have the right tools for the job. Um, in this case, I think I'm currently in the like leaning into the theme and expressing as many of the mechanics through like the sort of nonsense, really hammering home that this game, because like the design principle, the not the design principles, I've got a list of design principles, and then I've got like 3 things that you should hold in your heart whilst you play the game. And here it is, in fact. And the first one is drunk ass space orcs. Like you just have to think that way. The second one is play fast and ugly, and the third one is lie and cheat. So it's sort of intentionally saying like this is a game where we should have a good time trying to pull bullshit on each other, because it's a stupid dexterity game and there's no like, for example, like in the measuring rules, it's like you can pre-measure at any time, but it won't fucking help you.
Hmm. Yeah, I think I'd be like inclined to have a photo of a bunch of like random sized dice to sort of say,
Yeah.
you can use loads of lovely even square dice if you want, but here's what we're using when we play. The other one is like in relation to components that I sort of wonder is like because you tend to play on nice, smooth, neoprene playmats. I tend to play with like PVA'd sand onto a wooden board. And I wonder how very different the experience of trying to slide a
Oh, that is
dice.
literally the effect of rough terrain right there.
Yeah, but it's like the entire table is going to be very, very rough. Nobody's going to get anywhere because, like, as soon as you try and push a stack of even two dice across, like sand, a sand and PVA covered board, that's not going anywhere, is
Yeah,
it?
yeah, yeah. And for the same reason, like this game is currently like totally two-dimensional. Like you can barely make it up a small incline, let alone climb a ladder.
Yeah, and
Um,
I think that's a sort of another one where it's like, okay, you maybe need to indicate the sort of
Potentially,
the
yeah.
texture of the playing. Well, it's an odd. It's just for to my mind, like as my game design mind is that's something I would never contemplate
Specifying.
specifying in
Mm.
any other game because it does not matter in the least. And I know tons, most clubs actually that I've ever been to for whatever reason tend to have those 2x4, wooden boards with
Mhm.
like with uh glued on sand. So a lot of my gaming life has been playing on those things, and the fact that they're like have a vastly different play
That's
experience.
funny. My gaming heritage is the green flocked paper that you get for model trains. Like my first board that I made as a kid was that green flocked stuff because,
Yeah, no,
that's what you could get, and it was silky smooth.
well, I wonder how it would affect the dice. You'd build up some static on that
Yeah, you might do.
the end of it. um
And so I think there's one other element of this which isn't a dexterity mechanic, but the other thing is that how melee is resolved is um, you and I throw essentially rock paper scissors, except it's thump, shove, and pinch. And
oh
this is like a relationship between you can either do damage, you can push me away, or you can take a loot, like D3 loot tokens from me, but they cancel each other out as you would expect. And you keep fighting until the models separate or one of them falls over. And so at some point, like somebody will be tempted to shove the other one and so on. But anyway, so that's like I tried a bunch of different things. I wanted something that was kind of like a macho bluffing game, and I got too fancy with it. And it just turned out that like throwing rock, paper, scissors with that selection, that particular selection of options turned out to just be actually pretty juicy.
I definitely assumed that the last of those three was going to be eye poke because that's clearly what I want to do with the scissors at that point.
Yeah,
And
that could be it actually.
in
You
a
you
Three
you
Stooges,
blind them and then snatch their bag.
possibly just because if it's going to be rock paper
So
scissors.
actually, this one's really annoying because the first version of this combat system had the cancel relationships in the other direction because it was swipe, shove, or stab, and that works really nicely. But it like mechanically within the game, it just is the opposite relationship that I want. It creates the wrong dynamics, and so I had to like come up with different symbols. And like pinch is a symbol that's well enough known and has an emoji that like shove, thump, and pinch is okay. But I preferred the stab.
Well, yes, I've put one of those into Puke Apocalypse.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, yeah, Puke I think is like it has flicking mechanics in it, ironically, given the fact that I don't personally like flicking games. But that's because of it's built around the physicality of laying down the tokens in it. And I do think it's one of the reasons that like dexterity mechanics are an interesting and at time an interesting fit with minis games because there's an inherent physicality of minis games of a tactile nature of moving things around. At the same time, there is a preciousness around tumbling, flicked objects around very delicate, very finely painted miniatures. It's like if you I want to do things with like throwing dice near other people's minis, and it's always like I can't do that because everyone will be like, not near my minis,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
thank you
yeah.
very much. And equally it's like I can totally see somebody like stacking up. I have a D6. Unfortunately, it's on the table behind the screen, so I'm not going to grab it. But I've got D6 about that big, made of solid marble. And totally, if you got to about 4 or 5 dice on your boss, I would hand that dice over to be the next one to go onto the stack, and it would definitely smash a mini into a mangled heap. Which I imagine being the spirit of the game, but potentially not delight certain players.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so I do think that there's an odd relationship around the fact that like minis are made to be handled and made to be a tactile object, and made to be moved, and etc. etc. But they are also an object to be like carefully
Yeah,
revealed.
they're also a precious object.
Yeah, so they I mean I think they inherently have a weird. There's a weird thing about that object to them. It's like this maybe as a side note, once or twice I've seen like people argue that the reason that they don't need like CE marking for their minis is that minis are collector's items. And then the reason they're not collector's items is that collector's items get put into a glass case and only touched with kid gloves, and minis get picked up and then touched repeatedly. And it is, yeah, they are this weird thing that are in this weird place around sort of physicality and non-physicality. And so I definitely really want to sort of just put in mechanics where they move around and fall over and get knocked about. And like it's like when I was
Yeah,
showing.
and I think like this is one of the things that like what it made me think was like there's another version of Gaslands which is much more aggressive with the fact that these are toy cars and they're virtually valueless to you. And so like there's a we could call it like a like a stock car racing kind of a thing where you're not really intended to paint and lovingly convert your miniatures and superglue bits on. You're supposed to have some like beat up toy cars so that we can have some sort of slightly more aggressive dice chucking mechanics or whatever. Because what I like about what I've been as I've been playtesting this, what I've been enjoying is that it connects like this physical act of play, this like the fact that you're moving toys around, which is always there with miniatures games. Like all of the other parts of the game are now starting, or more parts of the game are starting to join in with that sort of silly, gleeful part of it. And obviously, like there's a, there's the miniature game design literate part of me that's like, oh well, it's wonderful that there are these random number generating objects that now are also producing random positions, and we've got all kinds of new relative things to play against. But it's also like it's just fun that there's more stuff happening in the play area, and like rolling a dice for a bullet, like it's a new kind of cinema that like now I can see that I can trace the line in a way that I would never see in like a normal kind of shooting game. Like there's the line of sight of the tape measure, but it's just yeah, it's just there's a new playfulness about it that's got me kind of excited to explore more.
Well, it's quite a meta sort of move that generally in minis games the dice are a sort of an ethereal object that don't exist and have any physical reference on the world of the miniatures.
Yeah.
And to say like, well, these dice where they land is where you are heading, it connecting the minis more physically to the dice, not just. You can obviously now get like random nice dice number generators on your phone, right?
Mm.
And you can totally go like, oh, roll 10d6 and it poops it out. And it's like, well, this is a game going, that's useless to you unless you're happy to hoik your smartphone onto the table from a distance. You need
Well,
to.
actually, so yeah, as you talk about that, like it makes me wonder, like if you had a bag of sorry, two thoughts combined at the same time there crashed in my head. So one of the things that's interesting about placing those dice into the play is it's a bit like a cursor click in a sort of real-time strategy video game. Like it's a temporary, tangible sort of event in the play area, whereas normally it would be happening off to the side and it would just be some ethereal random number generator. But it makes me think, well, what if you took the order dice from bolt action, which are, mostly just used as status recording things, but like if there was a way of saying, well, I'm placing an order dice into play, and it's both the order that the unit has been given, but also like the target place that they're going, or the selected unit, or whatever. Like there's a potential sort of World War II combat game where you are issuing orders, and that order is represented physically in a location, and the troops have got to move towards it when they activate or whatever.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, yeah, again, it's sort of like my interest in Puke Apocalypse was in trying to turn, status noting tokens, which are usually this ethereal, non-connected sort of meta
Mm.
thing, to something that the minis know exist in their
Mm.
world and actually sort of interact with physically. And so yeah, so that's one thing that very much excites and attracts me about dexterity games. Obviously, there is a sort of a chaos to dexterity elements, and I think one of the things that's particularly interesting about them is that it gives a rise and fall of moments in a certain way. And I think, in honesty, that's what I like about stacking games and mini
Mm.
dexterity based stacking mini games, maybe more to the point, rather than flicking games, because there's a definite like peak and trough of tension in stacking that doesn't exist necessarily in the same way of a flicking game. A flicking game is a different moment of tension and like
Yeah, it's a very discrete
different rate
sort
of
of.
story.
Yeah, it's a very discrete moment, which has like quite a, it does work, it doesn't work kind of an outcome. Whereas like the first block in a stacking thing is always 100% stable and certain, and the second one is like 90%, and then it like ratchets up in a very
Yeah.
predictable kind of.
And
Yeah.
everyone can follow the story. Everybody knows it's a very sort of human thing to understand that as the tower is getting taller, it's getting more and more rickety and etc. etc.
Yeah.
And I think it's like I think one of the things. So talking about Gaslands, I think one of the things that works so well with Gaslands is the mini sort of gameplay loops in it. And we do talk sometimes about like different gameplay loops. And you've got the skid dice in Gaslands, which is this little mini loop, and you've got the hazard resolution and stuff, which is a slightly bigger loop, and then you've got the race, which is this whole loop that all of these little wheels sit into. And
Hmm.
having the little mini loops gives you little peaks and troughs of tension, and then the bigger one, contributes to it. And having like the little stacking game being an ongoing mechanic is this little extra peak of tension, because otherwise a game otherwise is like a single thing that goes from one point to another, and if someone loses like early or gets in a bad position, the tension can very easily drain out of that. But if you can give a good solid secondary or tertiary loop, people can keep having their little mini bits of tension, so you can be fully out of the race in Gaslands but still be like, oh, but can I get the spin and slide that I want, and can I manage my hazards? Because you can then like you can
Yeah,
step
you
back into your own mini
we
game.
often see, I often see either people I'm demoing to or players that I'm playing with willfully ignoring that they're not really in a winning position because they are like enjoying a little micro story of their own.
Exactly, and I think like something like a stacking game, I think, can be very sort of in intense to focus on, and giving somebody this little again, we mentioned it I think the other week. There's Mega City Oceanas is this game where you have to stack up these little buildings and then slide them across the table, and you very quickly see the downtime in that game is people like hunched over their little building stacking, completely absorbed by like stacking these things. And I think it's a very absorbing thing, and so I think it gives you a real way of keeping people engaged, even as they may be out of the larger game as a whole. Well, I think for now, I don't know how much we really got into dexterity mechanics, like fully as an idea, in minis games generally, but we certainly got into it in relation to space gits, which people can access now on
Yeah, so if you head on over to planetsmashergames.itch.com, you can give me $5 for that. If you are lucky enough to be a Patreon supporter, you will get that for free by finding the link in various places, such as on planetsmashergames.com and probably in the link below.
Yeah, well,
Um, in the description below, I should say. Yeah, so I'm excited to get this game out into people's hands because it's silly and it's different, and I want to know. I want to like. There's a lot of places that it isn't going to work, and it's going to bounce off certain tables, and I kind of am curious to know why. And I haven't put very many guide rails in, and I might need to put more, but there's a sort of slippery slope that like the game itself is sort of unpoliceable, and so setting up a good sort of environment for what I expect you to how I expect you to interact with this, and then giving you the sort of fuse to light the dynamite for yourself, I think is going to be stronger than trying to like create a tight set of tournament rules for how you space Gits.
So, with that request from Mike, I think what people should do, they should pause the video now. They should go down into the links below where there'll be a link to itch and whatnot. Go get Space Gits, read Space Gits, come back, go down into the comment section, and tell Mike what you think about Space Gits right now. If you're not willing to go through all of that, or you don't want to give your judgment too quickly, just go down into the comment section, tell us what you think about dexterity mechanics and stacking or flicking, or what your favorite dexterity mechanic is and how you think it could work in a minis game and or not. While you're doing that and you're in that sort of general down below the video part of the screen, do hit the like and subscribes for us. And then, yes, I would say, please swing by Mike's itch, swing by his Patreon, swing by either of our websites and buy our games for us, and swing by our Discord and tell us about what fools we are to put dexterity mechanics into games, or what heroes, either or. I mean, so long as I'm loved or hated, I don't mind, as long as it's not ignored. But for now, for this episode of Rule of Carnage, it's going to be a thank you and goodbye. So thank you and goodbye. Bye bye.
Bye bye.